Major funding for these programs is provided by grants from HSH Nordbank and First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Perfect Building Maintenance, Allied Partners, Bank of America, Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Greenberg Traurig LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Antares Investment Partners, ARBOR Realty Trust, ATHENA Group, BRT Realty Trust, Burden LLP, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Habitats, City Investment Fund, CUSHMAN and WAKEFIELD, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Helmsley Spear, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Jackson Development Group, Meridian Capital Group, McSam Hotel Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Moynihan Organization, Muss Development, PALIN Enterprises, Rosenthal and Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sidney Fettner Associates, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, SUTPHIN Properties, the WITKOFF Organization, Extreme Construction and Deconstruction.
Hello, my name is Michael Stoller, host of Building New York. When you talk about New York, when you're talking about building of New York, there are legends, and today I truly have a legend. I have the legendary Peter Malken, the chairman of W&M Properties and the chairman of Wien Malkin, the owner of 11 million square feet, the general partner, managing partner of some of the famous buildings in New York, Westchester, and throughout the country. I'd like to thank Peter for being here.
Thank you for having me.
So, Peter, you were born in Brooklyn. You were born at Brooklyn Jewish Hospital, and you resided on Ocean Avenue, 2 blocks from Ebbets Field.
163 Ocean Avenue, second block of Ocean Avenue, 4 blocks from Ebbets Field.
And you went to public school 241?
Right.
And 241 has continued to be in involvement with you for your entire lifetime.
It has. For the last decade, my wife and I have been principals for a day at PS 241, which looks exactly as it did when I went there.
So what happened? So you go to PS 241. I think let's go about your dad. Your dad was in what type of business?
My dad had a company that manufactured first children's shoes and then ladies' handbags. And he had the office for distribution of that product at 347 Fifth Avenue across from the Empire State Building.
Which has some very interesting story in a second about that.
It has. I would visit 347 Fifth Avenue and look at the Empire State Building.
I want to talk about, you graduate 241, you go to Poly Prep, but before that, there was a very interesting thing that happened in your life. You said your dad was going to a meeting with the legendary Larry Wien, who became your mentor, your partner, and everything else.
Right.
You were 11 years of age, and you were sitting in the car, because your dad was in Connecticut, and your wife-to-be was 8 years of age, and she was sitting in a car. What happened?
Well, Mr. Wien was holding a meeting to start a golf club known as Birchwood Country Club. And my father went to that first meeting in Westport. And I happened to go along with him, and he left me in the car. And I was in the parking lot. I got out, walked around, and saw this cute little girl playing with puppets in the back of a station wagon. And she wouldn't come out. And I thought it was because she was too young, but turned out later she didn't come out because she had on bobby socks. But she's my wife, and we've been married for almost 53 years.
So you graduate, you go to Poly Prep in Brooklyn.
Right.
And now you then go to Harvard.
Harvard College, right.
And at Harvard College, you decide to go to Harvard Law School.
Right.
And during that period of time, I think when you started Harvard Law School, you got married to your present wife.
We were
the same
married.
woman that you've been married to for 52 years.
We were married on July 10th, 1955, a couple of weeks after I graduated from college.
So here's the interesting thing. You know, your dad was proverbial in the schmatte business, and
Leather schmatte.
leather schmatte, but he was in the schmatte business, and you really never knew, you know, you wanted to be an attorney, but we'll get to how you became, besides an attorney, a major real estate player. While you're in law school, you work for Sherman Sterling, you told me.
Right, summer clerk.
Summer clerk, and you have an offer to work for Sherman Sterling, and you also have an offer from your father-in-law, Mr. Wien, to work for him. What happens then?
Well, I had this terrific offer from Sherman Sterling at what was then the top going rate at the best law firms in New York. It was $6,500 a year. And I was set to go there to work. And my father-in-law said he really would like me to come and work with him. And I said, I don't think that's a very good idea. And we talked about it a lot, and then he said to me, you go to Sherman and Sterling, in 10 years you can be a partner, in 15 years you'll be making decisions. You come to work with me, in 3 years you'll be making decisions, and if it doesn't work, you'll be out on the street. And when he said that, I decided that's where I'd go.
But you told me when we met a very interesting story. Your office, which has continually been in the Lincoln building,
Right.
Was on the 47th floor.
48th floor.
48th floor. And you had a friend who went to law school who has a very interesting wife.
Well, it's really actually a fascinating coincidence, because on Saturday we took the Acela down to Washington for the opening of the Norman Foster courtyard in the National Portrait Gallery, where he has enclosed this enormous space using the techniques he used with the British Museum. And as we got on the Acela in Stamford, we left our car in our building at Metro Center, and we got on the train, and as we started sitting down, someone looked up and said, "Hi, Peter." And there were Marty Ginsburg and Ruth Ginsburg. And we rode down to Washington together. Mrs. Justice Ginsburg of the United States Supreme Court. And Marty and I were study mates. We had a study group. And while Ruth was at the law review, we would study together and babysit for their daughter Jane, who's now a professor of law at Columbia. And Marty started working at Weil Gotshal on the 47th floor, Weil Gotshal and Manges, the same day I started working at what was then Wien, Lane, Klein and Purcell on the 48th floor. And my recollection is that there were either 10 or 12 lawyers at Wien, and there were 15 lawyers at Weil. And when Marty left Weil Gotshal to relocate to Washington, there were something like 450 lawyers at Weil Gotshal. There might be 600 or 700 now. I don't know how many there are. But we grew our firm, really at my impetus, to about 55 lawyers, but we specialized only in real estate and tax work and estate work. But about 15 years ago, we decided that there really was not, in my opinion, a future for a boutique, smaller firm like that. And so most of the partners in our firm were able to be placed as partners in other major law firms in New York. And we now have 7 lawyers, and we do only our own work. It's really our own in-house legal staff.
Let's talk a little bit about Mr. Wien, because I think when I was doing some research, his father invested in secondary mortgages, I believe.
Right.
And he felt that was better than the stock market, which probably was.
Right.
And then in the mid-30s, Mr. Wien does what? He creates the first syndication?
Well, what happened was that he graduated from Columbia Law School in 1927, and he was a litigator. And then when the Depression came, these secondary mortgages, as you call them, on apartment houses in Manhattan, all the first mortgages went into default. And Mr. Wien's father, Joseph Wien, who had very large silk mills in New Jersey, actually, said, "You've got to take care of these for me." And as I think I told you before, one of the great prides that Mr. Wien had was that he never lost a building during the Depression. And he went to all of the lenders, the first mortgagees, the banks and insurance companies, and said, you can have these properties, or I'll run them for you for nothing. And you'll do better with me doing that than if you took them. And they all let him do that. And he carried all these buildings through the Depression and the recovery. And just a sidelight, he ultimately sold each of these buildings to the superintendent of the building, mostly minority people, who became real estate owners as a result of that. Generally sold it for about $1,000 down, and the balance over 20 years or so to give them an ownership. But he learned the real estate business that way. And that led him to decide that really he would be more involved as a real estate investor rather than a practicing lawyer, although he continued to call himself a counselor at law. He never litigated after that. He began buying buildings in the late 1930s and the early 1940s, and basically put together groups for his family and friends and law clients in small groups, and bought small office and retail buildings. I remember it was a building in Garden City was a retail store. But in 1947, well, I should say that one of the things he did as a lawyer is he researched the issue, the problem of the double taxation, corporate taxation of entities that owned real estate. And there were some major real estate companies that were public, but they never did very well. Bob Dowling was the head of a major real estate, General Realty, and so on, because they paid a double tax. And so he was able to find a case involving a major family trust in Cleveland, called the Cleveland Trust Company case, where a family had a large number of descendants, 40 or 50 descendants, and they were all beneficiaries. And the government tried to tax this trust, which owned real estate, as a corporation. And the courts ruled, no, it wasn't a corporation, it wasn't in business, it was a passive trust that simply owned this property. And Mr. Wien came up with the idea, well, if that could happen, he could create things that would meet the tests that the court laid down. And that was the beginning of real estate syndication. He was the first one to do real estate syndication, first in small groups, and then
with the SEC.
He was the first one to register with the SEC. In fact, the SEC at the time didn't think that investments in real estate were securities. They thought they were real estate. And he said, no, if they're large numbers of people, they're securities and they should be registered.
Now, before you joined him, he acquired the Lincoln Building, which you were in today.
1954.
In 1947, what, the Toy Building?
Well, in 1951, he acquired the 200 Fifth Avenue. In 1950, 501 7th Avenue. A number of other buildings earlier than that, in the 40s.
In 1958, when you joined him, he acquired what, the Plaza Hotel?
Soon after I joined the firm, he acquired the Plaza Hotel in 498, 500, 512 7th Avenue, the Desert Inn in Las Vegas, which was the first clean money to go into Las Vegas, where he didn't want to run the building, but he did a purchase and lease back to the group that owned the property. The Plaza Hotel, when it was announced in the paper that he was buying the Plaza Hotel, on that Monday morning following the announcement, there were people lined up in front of the Lincoln Building wanting to invest in the Plaza Hotel.
Let's talk about the next investment, the investment that you were involved with also with him, which was the Empire State Building. And
right.
I think it's a very interesting story.
Well, that was in October 1961. And actually, Mr. Wien had his office in the Empire State Building for many years until he bought the Lincoln Building and moved up to 42nd Street. But he had always had the thought of owning the Empire State Building. And in 1958, I believe it was, there was a Chicago group that owned the Empire State Building, and one of the partners in that group came to Mr. Wien and said that the building could be for sale and would Mr. Wien be interested in buying it. And he said yes. And after a lot of study, he made an offer, and then that gentleman, Roger, I forgot his last name at the moment, went back and sold his interest, a minority interest, to Colonel Crown based on the price Mr. Wien was willing to pay for the building. In 1961, it was thought that Congress was going to pass a new law which was going to eliminate the special low tax rate on capital gains and subject capital gains to the then highest marginal rate, which I think was 78%, and instead of 35% or so. And Colonel Crown, having been advised of this, that law could be passed in 1962 and would be effective as of January 1, 1962, decided that he would sell the Empire State Building to take advantage of the low capital gain rate at that time. So Mr. Wien and I formed what was then a general partnership, entered into a contract to buy from Colonel Crown a lease on the land and title to the building. Colonel Crown had previously sold the land
to Prudential
Insurance and took back a lease, but had retained title to the building. So after we signed the contract to acquire the property, and Harry Helmsley was the broker who negotiated for Mr. Wien the purchase, we then made another deal with Prudential where we sold the fee title to the building because for the first time mutual insurance companies were going to have to pay income tax, and they could use the depreciation. And so they increased their investment, basically, which was in the land, to include the building, and extended the lease, which had about 50 years to go, out to 114 years. And that's how we acquired the lease on both the land and the building.
And then you put together, what, 3,900 investors?
Well, they're actually, we created units of investment of $10,000 each. There was $33 million in cash and a $6 million purchase money mortgage. So there were 3,300 units of $10,000 each. Some people bought more than one unit, so that there were about 3,000 investors. But we had only about 6 weeks within which to register with the SEC and offer the investment. It took about 3 or 4 weeks to get through the SEC, so we had 2 weeks to raise the money. And $33 million in 1961 would be $300 million now, something like that. And there were not the sources of CMBs or CDOs.
But those investors have done rather well over the 46 years.
You know, the return is averaged better than 50% a year over that time on the original investment.
And after the Empire State Building, I know that you and Mr. Wien bought a couple of hotels in the city.
There were actually 13 hotels, I think, at one time. The Taft Hotel, the Governor Clinton Hotel, the Lexington Hotel on Lexington Avenue, and a couple of others in New York.
And then you went downtown, because a lot of the buildings that were acquired were on 7th Avenue, on Broadway, and so on, not far from the Empire State Building or from the Lincoln Building. And you acquired a couple of buildings on William Street and on Broadway.
Well, we bought 120 Broadway, we bought 25 Broad Street, we bought 19 Rector Street, 123 William Street, 116 John Street. And then Irwin Wolfson, who had built the Pan Am building, had assembled the land on the block to the north of 120 Broadway, on which he was planning to build a major building. And unfortunately found out that he was dying of cancer. And he came to Mr. Wien and said that he would like Mr. Wien to take over his position to protect his wife and children. And it related back to an earlier situation where a building, I believe it was on Church Street, that Mr. Wolfson was building, and there were certain changes in the mortgage market and so on, and there were some problems, and Mr. Wolfson came to Mr. Wien and said he needed an investor to put up the equity to complete the building. And Mr. Wien put up the equity, and when the building was finished and was financed, Mr. Wolfson came back and said, Larry, this is the biggest building I've built, and I really would like to own it myself for my family, and I'd like to buy back your half interest. And Mr. Wien said, okay, but on one condition. And he said, well, what's that condition? He said, that you pay me only what I invested with you, nothing more than that. And Wolfson was very surprised and said, well, that's not fair, you should get more than that. And Mr. Wien said, okay, why don't you endow a professorship at Brandeis University, where Mr. Wien was chairman of the board, and that became the Wolfson Professorship, actually named for Erwin Wolfson's uncle, who was the leading professor of Judaic Studies at Harvard for many, many years. Well, in any event, because of that incident, Mr. Wolfson came to Mr. Wien and said, I know that you would protect my wife and children, and I'd like you to take over this development. And Mr. Wien said, well, I can't do that because I own 120 Broadway, and that's the natural competition. But if you agree, what I'll do is I'll enter into an arrangement with Harry Helmsley, where Harry will take over the development, but Harry will sign an agreement that he will not take any tenant from 120 Broadway. And that way, I'll protect you, Erwin, and I'll protect 120 Broadway and my investors in that building. And so Mr. Wien said that he could not be a partner in 140, but he had no objection to my being a partner in 140, so I became a minor partner with Harry Helmsley in what became the Marine Midland building, which is now the Brown Brothers Harriman building.
1185 Avenue of the Americas.
We bought that in 1978 from the Fisher family. Martin Fisher, the senior brother in the Fisher family, had passed away, and for estate reasons there was need to raise some liquidity. I believe the Fishers have never sold any other building that they built, any office building anyway. But they were negotiating, Larry Fisher was negotiating, I believe it was with Equitable, to sell a 1/2 interest in 1185 Avenue of the Americas, which was known as the J.P. Stevens building, to the insurance company. And something came up and the deal fell apart. And one of my partners at what was then Wien, Lane & Malkin, was representing the Fishers on the sale of the half interest. And he came back to our office and reported to Mr. Wien and me that a problem had arisen and the deal had fallen through. And Mr. Wien picked up the phone, called Larry Fisher and said, Larry, I understand there's a problem, and do you still want to sell? And Larry Fisher said yes. And Mr. Wien said, well, I won't buy half interest, but I'll buy the building for twice what you were going to sell a half interest to Equitable for. And Larry Fisher said, okay, but your firm's got to represent me on the sale. And Mr. Wien said, we can't do that. We can't be on both sides. So we selected a real estate lawyer named Lasher, I believe his name was, at Weil Gotshal to represent the Fishers. And we did buy the building, 1185 Avenue of the Americas.
Over your career, because I don't have much time, but I do want to bring it out, you were involved with the Corinthian and the other building, the Alexandra, simultaneously in 1988?
88, 89.
Correct. And one of them, which was the airline terminal
the
building.
East Side Airlines Terminal building on First Avenue on 37th Street was to be sold by the Triborough Bridge and Tunnel Authority. And someone came to me and said that he had an idea for buying it and would I want to be his partner in it. And he told me his idea, which was very ingenious. He is a physical engineer, a PE, and he saw that you could take the foundation of the Eastside Airlines terminal and the bus terminal under it, and used that as the foundation for a major building.
So you and Mr. Spitzer Sr.,
Bernie Spitzer
built that building, a 53-story building, or 53 or 57, something like that.
57, I think, but Bernie Spitzer really built it. He's the builder. I was
Right,
just
but then you did the other development, because I want to make sure that I can bring out things.
Right.
You built the other building on the west side on 72nd Street. But an interesting thing, because my studio is in the B. Altman building, you bought the Altman chain. You bought
Right.
the old department store chain.
We bought the chain. Mort Olshan and I. Mort really was once again was the leader, and we bought the chain from the Altman Foundation, which had been given the company by Bernard Altman, who created the business and had no heirs. So those were all at just about the same time. That was a big year.
It's interesting because we're sitting here in the Altman building,
Right.
but also at that time you had the old Altman store in Westchester, which subsequently you closed, and you now own, what, 20% of the
Westchester.
Of the Westchester Mall, the
Right.
Westchester.
Our partnership, Mort Olshan and I.
Right.
And actually, Mr. Wien died in 1988. Became ill in the middle of 1988 and died on December 10th, 1988. So when the opportunities came up to buy Altman's and to invest in buying and building the Alexandria and the Corinthian, he was not active anymore. So these were my decisions to do, and I had very good partners.
And then you also started buying buildings in Westchester over the period of time.
Right. Actually, we started building in the late 1970s. I built 2 buildings in Darien at exit 13 on the Turnpike, and then built a building called Soundview Plaza at exit 9 on the Turnpike, and then built Metro Center at the railroad station in Stamford, 1978-79, which I believe is the best building in Connecticut and gets the highest rents of any building in Connecticut. And we're now working on building a 20-story office building next to Metro Center at the railroad station in Stamford, Connecticut, a mixed-use building. Very happily, the Rose family, with whom I've been very close, Jonathan Rose, is building the apartment part of it on the south side of the property, and we're building the office building.
So in your career, which has been illustrious, I truly have to say, you, with the late Larry Wynn, and yourself, now with your son Tony, how truly you've been a builder of New York, and I'd like to thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
Major funding for these programs is provided by grants from HSH Nordbank and First American Title Insurance Company of New York, Perfect Building Maintenance, Allied Partners, Bank of America, Murray Hill Properties, SJP Properties, Greenberg Traurig LLP. Additional funding is provided by grants from Antares Investment Partners, ARBOR Realty Trust, Athena Group, BRT Realty Trust, Burden LLP, C.B. Richard Ellis, City Habitats, City Investment Fund, Cushman and Wakefield, Eastern Consolidated, Essex Capital Partners, Helmsley Spear, James D. Kuhn Real Estate Institute at Syracuse University, Jackson Development Group, Meridian Capital Group, McSam Hotel Group, Newmark Knight Frank, Moynihan Organization, Muss Development, PALIN Enterprises, Rosenthal and Rosenthal, Signature Bank, Sidney Fettner Associates, Stonehenge Partners, Studley, SUTPHIN Properties, the WITKOFF Organization, Extreme Construction and Deconstruction.